The baron's estate rose from the countryside like a statement of conquest, its stone walls pale against the dark forests that pressed in from every direction. Long before a visitor reached the iron gates, they would feel the weight of the place, the silence that followed the crack of whips, the way the air itself seemed trained not to protest. The land had once been common ground, worked by small farmers whose names were now forgotten, but under the baron's rule it had been reshaped into a monument to his will. Vineyards stretched in perfect lines, fields bent under harvests wrung from exhausted hands, and at the heart of it all stood the manor, high and unyielding, its windows like unblinking eyes. The baron liked to say that order was the greatest virtue a man could impose on chaos, and his estate was proof that chaos, when broken correctly, could be made profitable. He had inherited wealth, but not respect. That, he believed, had to be taken. As a young man, he learned quickly that cruelty, when worn confidently, could pass for strength. He learned that fear traveled faster than kindness and lasted longer. Those who worked his lands knew his voice before they knew his face, knew the sound of his boots on gravel and the pause that always came before he spoke, as though he enjoyed watching men shrink in anticipation. He did not rage often. He found anger inelegant. Instead, he laughed. His laughter was sharp and sudden, arriving in moments where mercy might have been expected, and it unsettled people more than shouting ever could. To laugh at suffering, he believed, was to prove dominance over it. The enslaved people on his estate were counted like livestock and discussed like tools. Their names were recorded in ledgers only when necessary and forgotten just as easily. The baron spoke of them in abstract terms, numbers, productivity, losses, as though distance could cleanse him of responsibility. He told his guests that sentimentality was a disease of weak rulers and that history favored men who did not hesitate. In the evenings, when wine flowed freely and guests gathered beneath chandeliers, he would boast of his efficiency, of how little waste he allowed. Sometimes he told stories, embellishing moments of punishment into anecdotes meant to entertain. When laughter rippled across the table, he felt confirmed, validated by the sound of others joining him in dismissal of human pain. He took pride in being modern, in dismissing old superstitions and village fears as relics of ignorance. Priests bored him unless they reinforced obedience, and folk beliefs amused him endlessly. If a servant crossed themselves too quickly, or whispered a prayer after an accident, the baron would smirk and remark on how fear kept lesser minds occupied. He believed only in what could be measured: land, gold, bloodlines. Fate, to him, was a word people used when they lacked the courage to admit failure. He liked to say that the world rewarded those who seized it firmly enough. When he said it, his eyes gleamed with certainty, and no one at his table dared contradict him. His authority extended beyond the estate into the nearby villages, where people lowered their voices when his name was spoken. Disputes were settled in his favor, debts were called in at his convenience, and favors were repaid with interest. He cultivated this reach carefully, ensuring that gratitude and fear were so closely entwined that no one could separate them. To some, he was a benefactor who provided work and protection. To others, he was a shadow that darkened every future plan. He enjoyed both perceptions, understanding that power was strongest when it could be interpreted in multiple ways. Within the manor, luxury softened every surface. Silk drapes filtered sunlight into a perpetual glow, and polished floors reflected the movement of servants who glided silently through halls they were forbidden to linger in. The baron rarely noticed them unless something displeased him. When he did, correction was swift and public. He believed that discipline, like theater, required an audience. Those moments were etched into memory, replayed in whispers long after the baron had moved on, satisfied that order had been restored. Yet for all his confidence, the baron was deeply invested in appearances. He hosted lavish gatherings, not merely for pleasure, but as proof of his unassailable position. Invitations were extended strategically, alliances reinforced with wine and flattery. His upcoming wedding was to be the greatest display yet, a union that would bind his wealth to an even older name, silencing any lingering doubts about his legitimacy among the aristocracy. He spoke of the wedding often, relishing the envy it provoked. To him, it was the final seal on a life well conquered. In private moments, he reflected on how far he had come, not with humility but with satisfaction. He remembered challenges only to marvel at how easily they had been overcome. Opposition, in his mind, existed only to be crushed, and he took each victory as evidence that the world operated according to rules he had mastered. He dismissed warnings, ignored unease, and scoffed at the idea that the past could ever demand repayment. To the Baron, consequence was something that happened to other men. The enslaved quarters lay far from the manor deliberately, out of sight, but the Baron knew they were there, just as he knew the cost of maintaining them. He visited rarely, and when he did, it was to inspect rather than observe. Faces blurred together for him, individual suffering held no interest. If a body failed, another would replace it. This logic, repeated often enough, became a truth he no longer questioned. When rumors reached him of illness or unrest, he treated them as inconveniences, problems to be managed, never as moral failings. On the day that would later be remembered for different reasons, the Baron was in excellent spirits. Business had gone well, the wedding plans were progressing flawlessly, and the weather itself seemed to favor him. When news arrived that a slave had been gravely injured and wished to speak to him, the Baron reacted not with concern, but with irritation tinged by curiosity. Death, after all, made people dramatic, and he found such moments faintly entertaining. He agreed to see the man, already anticipating the absurdity of whatever words would be dragged from a failing body. As he prepared to leave the manor, adjusting his coat and glancing at his reflection, the Baron felt entirely secure. The world, as he understood it, was stable, predictable, obedient. He walked through halls that echoed with his steps, a man convinced that nothing spoken by the powerless could ever touch him. The laughter that so often followed cruelty was already forming, ready to dismiss whatever final plea or accusation awaited him. He had built his life on the certainty that curses were only words, and words, in his experience, bowed easily to power. The injured man lay on a narrow cot in a stone outbuilding that smelled of damp straw, old blood, and the sharp bitterness of untreated wounds. Light entered through a single barred window high on the wall, falling across his chest in a pale strip that rose and fell, unevenly with each breath. His body had long since stopped obeying him. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, wrapped in cloth already darkened by seepage, and his hands trembled with the effort of remaining conscious. The others who shared the space had been ordered out, not out of kindness but to avoid delay. Death, the overseer believed, should be efficient. Yet the man had asked to see the Baron, and that alone was enough to make the request unusual. He had not always been weak. Those who knew him remembered strength in his shoulders and patience in his hands, a quiet endurance that carried him through seasons of punishment without complaint. His name, spoken rarely and usually only among his own, had once meant reliability. Years of labor had etched themselves into his back and arms, but it was not work that had broken him. It was the fall, sudden, violent, careless. A loose beam, a shouted order, the crack of bone against stone. By the time he was carried away, he already knew the end was near. Pain had a way of clarifying such things. As he lay there, drifting between awareness and darkness, memories pressed in on him with unexpected clarity. He saw his mother's face as she had looked in the faint light of a fire long extinguished, heard the rhythm of a song half forgotten by everyone else. He remembered a time before chains, before the language of command had replaced conversation. These were not gentle recollections. They hurt almost as much as his body, but they anchored him, reminded him that his life had once belonged to him, even if only briefly. When the Baron finally arrived, his presence filled the small space like a change in weather. The guards straightened, boots scraping against stone, and the overseer stepped aside as though making room for something inevitable. The Baron's eyes flicked over the injured man with quick appraisal, not unlike how he might inspect a damaged tool. There was no pity in his expression, only mild annoyance and faint interest. He had expected pleading, perhaps tears. What he saw instead was a gaze steady enough to meet his own. "So," the Baron said lightly, as if addressing a subordinate over a minor inconvenience, "you wish to speak before you die." His tone suggested generosity, as though granting this audience were an act of mercy rather than curiosity. He did not wait for a response before continuing. Make it quick." The injured man swallowed, the movement painful and slow. When he spoke, his voice was rough, worn thin by dust and years of silence forced upon him. Yet there was strength in it still, a resolve that surprised even him. He did not beg. He did not ask for forgiveness or relief. Instead, he spoke of what had been taken, not just from him but from those who had come before and those who would come after. He spoke of nights spent listening to others die quietly so as not to be noticed, of children born into chains and taught obedience before language. Each word seemed to cost him breath, but he continued, driven by something deeper than survival. The Baron listened with a faint smile. Arms crossed, weight shifted casually to one leg. He had heard variations of these complaints before and found them tiresome. To him they lacked originality. Suffering, he believed, was the natural condition of those without power. Yet as the man spoke, something in his tone resisted dismissal. There was no hysteria, no desperation, only certainty. When the injured man finally reached the end of his strength, his voice dropped to a whisper. He spoke then of justice, not as law or decree, but as balance. He said that pain did not vanish simply because it was ignored, that blood remembered the ground it soaked into. He spoke of a reckoning that did not require witnesses or weapo. En-ness, one that moved quietly and waited patiently. His eyes never left the Baron's face as he spoke the final words, shaping them carefully, as though carving them into the air. "You will not finish what you celebrate," he said. "Your joy will stop before it begins. As you laughed at our dying, so will the earth laugh at you." Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. The guards exchanged glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed something dangerous or merely strange. The overseer cleared his throat, preparing to intervene, but the Baron raised a hand, laughter already rising in his chest. It burst out suddenly, loud and unrestrained, echoing off the stone walls. He laughed not only at the words, but at the audacity of them, at the idea that a dying man could imagine himself powerful enough to pronounce judgment. "A curse?" the Baron said between chuckles. "Is that what you dragged me here for?" He shook his head, wiping a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. "I expected more creativity." He leaned closer, his shadow falling across the man's face. "You mistake suffering for significance. You are dying because you fell. Nothing more." The injured man watched him without flinching. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a calm acceptance. He had said what he came to say. The rest no longer mattered. As the Baron straightened and turned away, dismissing the moment as thoroughly as he dismissed the man's life, the injured man exhaled slowly, a sound that might have been relief. His chest rose once more, then stilled. The overseer stepped forward to confirm what was already evident. The guards relaxed, tension dissolving into routine. The Baron paused at the doorway, glancing back once more with a faint smirk. "Dispose of him," he said, already thinking of more pleasant matters. The words were delivered casually, as though instructing someone to clear a table after a meal. Outside, the air felt brighter, cleaner. The Baron inhaled deeply, pleased to have left the unpleasantness behind. The encounter lingered in his mind only briefly, not as a warning but as a joke he might later recount. He imagined repeating the words to his guests, eliciting laughter at the foolishness of superstition. To him, the dying man's final speech was nothing more than theatre, a last attempt to feel important in a world that had already decided otherwise. Yet inside the stone outbuilding, as the body was removed and the straw disturbed, something intangible seemed to settle into the space, as though the words spoken had not entirely vanished. No one present could have explained the sensation, and none would have dared mention it. The Baron, already walking away, felt nothing at all. He carried his laughter with him, confident that curses died with the mouths that spoke them, unaware that some words were never meant to be heard in the moment they were spoken. In the days that followed, nothing happened that could be pointed to with certainty. The sun rose and set as it always had, the fields were worked, the manor doors opened and closed with their familiar weight. If anyone had expected thunder or sudden calamity, they would have been disappointed. The Baron himself felt vindicated by the normality. He mentioned the dying man's words once at dinner, recounting them with theatrical exaggeration, and the table responded exactly as he anticipated, with laughter, raised glasses, and dismissive jokes about superstition. In that moment, surrounded by agreement, the memory lost what little substance it might have had. It became entertainment, stripped of meaning, Yet beneath the surface of routine, something subtle began to shift. It was not dramatic enough to demand attention, only persistent enough to be noticed by those whose lives depended on listening. The servants were the first to feel it. They spoke of restless nights, of dreams that ended abruptly in waking dread. More than one claimed to hear footsteps in empty corridors, the soft drag of something heavy where nothing should have been. Candles guttered without wind, and doors that had always closed smoothly began to stick, as though resisting their own purpose. These were small things, easily explained, and no one dared present them as anything more. The Baron noticed none of it. His attention was fixed on preparations for his wedding, a project that consumed him with equal parts pride and impatience. He demanded perfection, and the manor buzzed with activity as craftsmen, cooks, and tailors came and went. Each mistake, however minor, was met with sharp correction. The Baron's laughter surfaced often during these days, but it carried a different edge, more brittle than before. He slept less, though he attributed that to excitement. When he did sleep, his dreams were crowded and indistinct, dissolving into nothing when he woke. Accidents began to occur with inconvenient frequency. A groom fell from a ladder and broke his arm while hanging decorations. A carriage wheel cracked on a familiar road, overturning without clear cause. In the kitchens, a fire flared suddenly, scorching a wall before being contained. None of these incidents were severe enough to halt the Baron's plans, but they slowed them, introduced delays that irritated him. He dismissed concerns with irritation, accusing his staff of carelessness and incompetence. Order, he insisted, was being undermined by foolishness, not fate. Whispers spread regardless. Among the enslaved people and lower servants, the story of the dying man's final words circulated quietly, changing slightly with each retelling. Some said he had spoken a name. Others claimed the Baron's shadow had moved strangely as the curse was uttered. Fear found fertile ground in uncertainty, and even those who did not believe felt compelled to listen. The overseer attempted to stamp out such talk, delivering warnings and punishments, but rumors proved harder to control than labor. They moved unseen, carried by glances and half-sentences. The Baron's health, once robust, began to falter in ways he found insulting. It started with headaches that lingered longer than expected, a tightness in his chest that came and went without pattern. His physician offered mild explanations: stress, rich food, excitement. But the Baron bristled at the implication of weakness. He prided himself on endurance, on being untouched by the frailties of lesser men. When dizziness forced him to sit during an inspection of the grounds, he laughed it off loudly, making a joke of it before anyone else could speak. At night, he found himself waking suddenly, heart racing, convinced for a moment that someone stood at the foot of his bed. Each time the room was empty, the shadows familiar. He scolded himself for indulging in imagination, blaming the wedding for his unsettled sleep. Still, the sensation lingered, the feeling of being observed, weighed, measured. He began to leave candles burning longer than usual, as though light itself could be enlisted as a guard. The estate itself seemed less cooperative. Horses grew skittish, refusing commands they had obeyed for years. Crops in one field yellowed unexpectedly, despite proper care. Tools broke in the hands of experienced workers, wood splitting along strange lines. None of it amounted to disaster, but together it formed a pattern that unsettled those who noticed. The Baron, informed of these issues, responded with irritation rather than cons. He accused his managers of exaggeration, insisting that discipline would correct any decline. As the wedding drew nearer, tensions sharpened. Guests arrived earlier than planned, filling the manor with unfamiliar voices and expectations. The Baron moved among them with practiced charm, yet some remarked privately on his changed demeanor. His laughter came too quickly, his temper flared at trivial slights. He drank more than usual, though it did little to relax him. When conversation turned to omens or old stories, he interrupted forcefully, steering the topic elsewhere with visible impatience. One evening, as a storm gathered unexpectedly, the Baron stood at a window watching the sky darken. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the estate in stark fragments. For a fleeting moment, an image crossed his mind: the dying man's steady gaze, the calm certainty of his words. The thought irritated him deeply. He laughed aloud as if to drive it away, and turned back to his guests, refusing to grant the memory any power. In the servants' quarters, fear deepened. People avoided certain paths after dark, spoke in lower tones, crossed themselves despite knowing the risk. The story of the curse had become a framework for every mishap, a way to impose meaning on chaos. Even those who scoffed could not entirely shake the unease. It was easier to believe that something had been set in motion than to accept the randomness of misfortune under a man who claimed absolute control. The Baron remained publicly dismissive. Privately, cracks began to form in his certainty. He did not articulate them even to himself, but they revealed themselves in small habits. Checking locks twice, snapping at servants for entering unannounced, pausing mid-laugh as though listening for something he could not hear. Pride kept him from acknowledging fear, but it could not prevent the feeling Rom existing. As the final days approached, the atmosphere on the estate grew heavy, charged with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The wedding was meant to be a culmination, a triumph that would erase all irritation and delay. The Baron clung to this belief, convinced that once the ceremony was complete, everything would fall back into place. He told himself that joy would banish discomfort, that celebration would silence whispers. Yet beneath his confidence, the subtle sense of being watched persisted, a quiet pressure that did not fade. The words spoken by a dying man, once laughed at and dismissed, had not returned as thunder or fire, but as something far more difficult to confront, the slow erosion of certainty. And though the Baron continued to ignore the gathering shadows, they lengthened all the same, stretching patiently toward a moment he could no longer delay. The morning meant to usher in celebration arrived beneath a sky too clear to be comforting. Sunlight poured over the estate in generous abundance, gilding rooftops and fields alike, as though the world itself were determined to appear benevolent. From the earliest hours, the manor stirred with motion. Servants hurried through corridors carrying trays of flowers, bolts of fabric, polished silver. Musicians tuned their instruments in distant rooms, their tentative notes drifting through open windows. Everything moved according to plan, yet the air felt strained, stretched thin by expectation. It was the kind of morning that demanded perfection and offered none in return. The Baron rose before dawn, unable to sleep any longer. He dressed carefully, lingering over each detail with a mixture of pride and irritation. The mirror reflected a man who looked much as he always had, composed, well-groomed, commanding, but there was something unfamiliar in his eyes. They seemed restless, scanning his own reflection, as though searching for reassurance. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cuffs, and forced a smile, practicing the expression he would wear before his guests. It felt less natural than it once had. Outside his chambers, the estate buzzed with controlled urgency. Orders were issued and repeated, corrections made, tempers frayed. Small mistakes multiplied despite every effort to prevent them. A seam split in a gown moments after it was fitted. A crate of wine arrived spoiled, the corks blackened inexplicably. The Baron was informed of each issue in turn, and each time his response sharpened. His laughter, when it came, sounded brittle, as though it might shatter if pressed too hard. As guests began to arrive in earnest, carriages lining the drive in polished procession, the manor transformed into a stage. Greetings were exchanged, compliments paid, admiration directed toward the Baron and his impending union. He moved among them with practiced grace, accepting praise as his due. Yet even as he spoke, part of his attention seemed elsewhere, drawn inward by an unease he refused to name. His chest felt tight, his breath occasionally shallow, but he waved away concern when it was offered. Today, of all days, weakness was unthinkable. The bride had not yet arrived, remaining at a nearby estate until the appointed hour. The separation was traditional, meant to heighten anticipation. The Baron welcomed the custom, believing the distance would only sharpen the triumph of reunion. He spoke often of her elegance, her lineage, the harmony their marriage would represent. To him, the wedding was more than personal joy. It was confirmation that his rise was complete, that no whisper or doubt could reach him now. As midday approached, the first crack appeared. A messenger arrived, breathless, reporting that one of the ceremonial horses had thrown its rider and bolted, disappearing into the forest. Replacement plans were made quickly, but the disruption rattled those involved. The Baron reacted with irritation rather than alarm, insisting that contingencies existed for every inconvenience. Still, he felt a flicker of unease, quickly suppressed. Accidents happened. They always had. Inside the chapel prepared for the ceremony, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of polished benches and floral arrangements crafted to impress. The space was beautiful, flawless in its presentation. Yet those who lingered too long inside reported a strange heaviness, as though the air itself resisted celebration. Candles sputtered unexpectedly, flames wavering despite the stillness. The priest, a man accustomed to ceremony, paused more than once during his preparations, unsettled by a sense he could not articulate. The Baron entered the chapel briefly to inspect the arrangements. As he stood at the altar, imagining himself at the center of attention, a sudden dizziness washed over him. The room tilted, the bright colors blurring into harsh light. He steadied himself against the lectern, forcing a laugh that echoed too loudly in the empty space. He blamed hunger, excitement, anything that preserved his sense of control. When the sensation passed, he straightened and left, determined not to indulge further weakness. News arrived shortly thereafter that the bride's procession had been delayed. A wheel had cracked on the lead carriage, an unusual failure given its recent inspection. Repairs were underway, the messenger assured him, but the delay would be significant. Murmurs spread among the guests, curiosity tinged with unease. The Baron smiled tightly, assuring everyone that such setbacks were trivial. Inside, irritation churned into something darker, a pressure he could not release. As time stretched on, the sky began to change. Clouds gathered without warning, soft at first, then thickening into a heavy canopy that dimmed the light. A distant roll of thunder echoed, too low to be dramatic, yet impossible to ignore. The Baron noticed it and felt a sudden, unreasonable surge of anger. He had planned this day meticulously. The world had no right to intrude. He withdrew briefly from his guests, retreating to a private chamber to collect himself. Alone, the silence pressed in. His heart pounded harder than it should have, each beat pronounced and insistent. He loosened his collar, drawing in slow breaths, reminding himself that this was merely tension. As he did, a memory surfaced unbidden. The dying man's eyes, steady and unafraid, the certainty of his final words. The Baron slammed his fist against the table, startled by his own reaction. "Nonsense!" he muttered aloud, as though the word could banish the thought. When he returned to the gathering, the atmosphere had shifted further. Conversations were quieter, glances exchanged more frequently. The delay had grown long enough to strain patience, and speculation crept in despite efforts to suppress it. Another messenger arrived, face pale, reporting further trouble on the road. The procession had resumed, but progress was slow. The Baron's smile faltered for the first time. He felt a sharp pain lance through his chest, brief but intense, leaving him breathless. He waved away those who rushed to him, insisting on privacy. The storm broke suddenly. Rain lashed against the manor with startling force, thunder cracking overhead in violent punctuation. Guests cried out in surprise as windows rattled and the lights dimmed. Within moments, a servant reported that lightning had struck a tree near the chapel, blocking the path. Panic threatened to take hold, and the Baron raised his voice, commanding calm. His authority, usually so effective, felt thinner now, stretched by circumstance. Another messenger arrived, soaked and trembling. The bride's carriage had overturned in the chaos, he said. No lives lost but injuries sustained. The ceremony would have to be postponed. The words struck the Baron like a physical blow. For a moment the room seemed to spin again, the sound of rain fading beneath the roar of blood in his ears. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert control, but no words came. Pain surged through his chest, stronger than before, radiating outward, stealing his breath. He staggered, reaching for support that was not there. Guests cried out, servants rushed forward, but the Baron was already collapsing, his body betraying him in full view of those he had sought to impress. As he fell, his mind raced, fragments of thought colliding, anger, disbelief, the echo. of laughter once so easy. For the first time, the certainty he had built his life upon shattered completely. He did not hear the rain as it thundered on, nor the chaos that followed. He did not see the way guests recoiled, the way servants watched in stunned silence. His last awareness was a fleeting image, unbidden and unwelcome, a dying man's calm gaze, unmocked at last. The wedding bells, polished and waiting, remained silent. The ceremony meant to mark his triumph never began, halted not by rebellion or blade, but by the quiet, inexorable closing of his own breath. The silence that followed his collapse was unlike any the estate had known. It was not the stunned quiet that follows an accident, nor the reverent hush of grief, but something heavier, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock and were holding it close. Rain continued to fall outside, steady now, washing dust from stone and soil alike, but inside the manor time seemed to hesitate. People stood frozen, uncertain of their roles now that the man who had defined them lay motionless on the floor. Physicians were summoned in frantic haste, coats flapping, hands trembling as they knelt beside him. They murmured words meant to reassure, yet their expressions betrayed them. The Baron's face had already taken on a pallor that no intervention could disguise. When the final pronouncement came, it was delivered softly, almost apologetically, as though the truth itself feared being overheard. He was gone. The sentence ended not with drama, but with inevitability. News spread through the manor with astonishing speed. Guests retreated into clusters, whispering behind gloved hands, eyes darting toward the body as if expecting it to rise again and reclaim authority. Some crossed themselves, others stared in disbelief, the day's events refusing to align into anything sensible. The wedding, once the central focus of every thought, became an embarrassment of abandoned decorations and silent musicians. Flowers wilted in vases, candles burned down unattended, and the chapel stood empty, its careful beauty rendered meaningless. The bride, injured but alive, received the news hours later. She listened in stunned silence, the words failing to register at first. The future she had envisioned vanished in an instant, replaced by a void she could not yet name. Grief, relief, fear, all existed together, tangled and unresolved. She would mourn him publicly as expected, but privately she would wrestle with emotions she dared not voice. The marriage that was meant to define her life never existed beyond promise. Among the servants, reaction took a different shape. There was shock, yes, but beneath it stirred something else, an unspoken recognition that spread quietly from glance to glance. No one spoke the words aloud, not yet, but many thought of the dying man and the calm certainty with which he had spoken. Some felt fear sharpen rather than ease, worried that whatever force had claimed the Baron might not be finished. Others felt a fragile, guilty flicker of satisfaction, quickly suppressed. Joy, even imagined, felt dangerous. The enslaved people learned of the Baron's death through fragments, overheard conversations, sudden changes in routine. Work halted briefly, confusion rippling through quarters long accustomed to rigid order. Some wept openly, not for the man himself, but for the uncertainty his absence brought. Power vacuums were rarely kind. Others stood silently, heads bowed, remembering the final words spoken in that stone outbuilding. For them, the news carried a grim symmetry that did not require explanation. In the days that followed, the estate entered a period of uneasy suspension. Decisions were delayed, authority unclear. The Baron's relatives arrived, their grief assured and their intentions sharp. Ledgers were examined, alliances reconsidered, futures recalculated. The man who had once seemed immovable was reduced to ink on paper and arguments over inheritance. His voice, once so commanding, lingered only in memory, growing fainter with each passing hour. Stories began to circulate beyond the estate's boundaries. In nearby villages, the tale took on new details with every telling. Some said the Baron had laughed too loudly on the day he died, tempting fate itself. Others insisted the storm had arrived in answer to a wrong that could no longer be ignored. The dying slave's words were repeated more carefully now, stripped of mockery and infused with awe. What had been dismissed as superstition gained weight, carried on the breath of those who had little else to claim power. The estate changed subtly under new oversight. Punishments became less public, not out of compassion but caution. Certain practices were altered, certain paths avoided. The stone outbuilding where the injured man had died was left unused, its door closed, and its purpose quietly forgotten. No order was ever given to abandon it, yet no one volunteered to enter. Even those who scoffed at curses felt no need to test them. The Baron's legacy proved harder to control than his lands. His name, once spoken with fear or admiration, became a warning. Parents cautioned their children with it, servants exchanged glances when it surfaced in conversation. He was remembered not for the wedding that never happened, but for the laughter that echoed too long and stopped too suddenly. His certainty, once so unshakable, seemed foolish in hindsight, a brittle armor that shattered under pressure it refused to acknowledge. As time passed, the story settled into something like legend. Details blurred, motives sharpened. The dying man became a symbol rather than an individual, his suffering condensed into a single potent moment of defiance. Justice, elusive and often denied, found expression not through courts or decrees, but through narrative. People needed the story to mean something, to suggest that balance could exist even in a world so clearly skewed. Life on the estate continued, altered but unbroken. Fields were worked, harvests gathered, seasons turned as they always had. Yet an undercurrent of awareness remained, a quiet understanding that power was not as absolute as it pretended to be. Those who held authority now exercised it with greater care, whether out of wisdom or fear made little difference. The lesson had been delivered, and it lingered. The Baron himself faded into history, his portrait removed from prominent display, his possessions divided and sold. In time, even his face became indistinct in memory, reduced to a posture, a laugh, a reputation. What endured was not his wealth or ambition, but the manner of his end and the words that preceded it. He had believed himself immune to consequence, convinced that mockery could disarm meaning. In the end, it was meaning that outlasted him. On quiet nights, when the wind moved through the trees just so, some claimed to feel a presence, not threatening, not comforting, simply watchful. Whether this was imagination or something else mattered less than the effect it had. People remembered. They spoke more carefully, laughed less cruelly, hesitated before dismissing pain that was not their own. If the curse had accomplished anything, it was this lingering restraint. The story closed not with triumph or redemption, but with a question left deliberately unanswered. Was the Baron's death coincidence, stress, the fragile failure of a human body pushed too far? Or was it something else, set in motion by words spoken without fear? No single answer satisfied everyone, and perhaps that was the point. The uncertainty itself became a form of justice, denying the Baron the final word he had always claimed. Long after those who had known him were gone, the tale remained. It was told by firesides and in whispers, shaped by the needs of those who told it. At its heart was a simple truth that resisted erosion. Power that laughs at suffering builds its own reckoning. Whether through fate, chance, or the quiet insistence of memory, no laughter is ever truly without echo.